Excellent. It all seems to be working. As Doug mentioned, I'm a professor at the University of Manitoba. But like most professors, I didn't start my academic career as an early university student thinking that's where I was going to end up. I just went to university and wandered along my path for a while and fell into the Faculty of Kinesiology and Recreation Management at the University of Manitoba, where I studied recreation management as an undergrad student. But I had such an incredible experience and really enjoyed learning about festivals, events, tourism within our communities and how they contribute to recreation opportunity for residents, that when I finished my degree, I didn't quite feel finished. So while I went off and I worked in the community and worked for community events and festivals, I always felt this nagging pull to go back and explore festival and event contexts in a little bit more detail. So I did return to the University of Manitoba while I was working for the Winnipeg Fringe Theatre Festival. How many of you have been to a Fringe? Anywhere in Canada or North America? So I'll give you a little bit of background because that's going to come up a few times in my presentation today. Fringe festivals are theatre festivals. Typically, they're unjuried theatre festivals, so people come from, performing companies come from all over, and it's basically a lottery as to whether or not you get to perform at the festival. The festivals often have many venues that offer indoor performances, but they always typically have an outdoor space, an outdoor site, and many other venues. So they're very large community events that bring people together to engage in seeing theatre, creating theatre, and participating in that. And while the focus has traditionally been theatre, they often involve outdoor music venues, children's activities, and so on. So the Winnipeg Fringe Theatre Festival is one of the largest in the world. And I had the good fortune of starting at the Winnipeg Fringe as a volunteer coordinator, which is a really great way to enter a festival context, to really get a sense of how it operates and so on. Over years, while I was pursuing my master's degree and PhD, I had the good fortune of having a boss who was always happy to have me come back and work for the festival. So I managed to work as the festival coordinator, festival supervisor, and festival consultant over the time throughout my degrees. So what was really exceptional for me is the opportunity to engage in both academic research and practice simultaneously, and which really fed my thinking around issues related to event management. Currently, I'm a professor in the Faculty of Kinesiology and Recreation Management, and a lot of people kind of raise an eyebrow and aren't quite sure what that fit is. Event management is often taught through recreation management. And as such, when I talk about event management, when I talk about festivals and community events, I'm often focused on what is the experience people are having. Because I come at it from that recreation perspective, from a leisure studies perspective, where I'm interested in understanding how do we make excellent, unique, meaningful experiences for visitors. So throughout my career as a professor, I've been at the University of Manitoba now in this position for 11 years soon, and I've worked very hard to maintain a research program that is theory-based, that contributes to providing evidence-based ideas for practice, and that links continually back to practice. And so I'm always trying to grow the research that we do at my leisure tourism lab so that we're bringing in theory, contributing to practice, adding in theory, contributing to practice. And the reason we want to do that is so that the things that we study, the things that we see happening in communities are actually meaningful beyond the unique context that the research takes place. So I'm very committed to working with the community groups both within my own community, and I've worked with most of the major festivals in Winnipeg as well as throughout Manitoba, but also across Canada. I've had the great pleasure of having a collaborator at Ryerson and have had the opportunity to do research with Toronto Pride, Taste of the Danforth, Pelly Island Music Festival, as well as festivals out in Alberta and throughout the United States. So I'm hoping today to be able to share with you some of the research I've been working on and talk a bit about how it relates to practice, share with you a few case studies, but then hopefully begin a dialogue, as somebody said earlier, that allows for collaboration, that allows us to build off of each other and begin to contribute to the area of understanding emergency management for event management. So, festivals and community events. I'm very passionate about them, both personally as well as professionally. I have been attending my own community events since I was a young child, and we know from research that events and festivals have been going on throughout history. nothing new. People have been gathering across the world to share food together, to dance together, to sing together, to compete with each other throughout history. So it's nothing new. But the study of festivals and events is relatively new. And having a strong understanding of what the meaning of these events are to communities is something that we're just beginning to look at. We did a study about 5 years ago now that looked at what is the meaning of community events and festivals to the people who attend. And we had people complete what we call personal meaning maps. They're like a brainstorming activity of the community event they were attending. And we looked at all the different characteristics that people find deeply meaningful to them in attending their local community event or festival. And it's probably no surprise to the audience here, but what we found is that people have very personal experiences, social experiences, cultural experiences, place-based experiences, as well as physical experiences, and that these experiences last long after the festival or event has ended. They've gone back home and gone back into their daily lives. So festivals provide us with many different opportunities to have many experiences. I'm very interested in the leisure experience that it offers because we know of the many benefits of leisure, both for reducing stress, but also for bringing communities together. Within festival studies, we talk about a concept called communitas, which is ultimately about how people come together to have a shared experience in community. That festivals and events offer us that opportunity to come together from all walks of life to share in something meaningful together. I don't know about your communities, but from every other community and festival I have visited, there are people who have their festival friends. And in the research we've done, where we looked at the meaning of festivals to people, people regularly talked about that. That when I come to this festival, I see my neighbors that I never see all winter because everybody's closed up inside their houses in Winnipeg. And so they come together in this unique time and space to actually rejoin with their community. Or it's time for families to spend some time together. Everybody's busy, people feel rushed, and when they go to the festival or event, they're dedicated to spending that time together. There's another concept we talk about called liminality. And this is the idea that there's this time out of time is what liminality refers to. So that festivals and events offer us this unique time and space that is so vastly different than our daily lives. Chances are on a day-to-day basis when you ask people, how are you? How's it going? You get responses like, oh, I'm busy, I'm rushed, I'm stressed, I'm overworked, oh, I'm tired, I didn't sleep well. Those are very common. There's a lot of literature in leisure studies about how overworked and time-pressured people feel. Some of it is shown to be true, that in some areas we're busier, and in some ways we actually know that we work less than maybe we have in the past, but we know that people feel time pressure differently. And so regardless of whether or not people are actually busier or whether or not they feel busy, we feel that pressure and it's very real to us. And festivals offer us the unique opportunity to escape that, to have this unique time and space that is outside of our everyday experiences. Even in our own recreation lives and leisure lives, you know, where pretty much every night of my life I'm on Netflix. And I have little kids, so there's not a lot of other options. And you know, once in a while I get to go to a Pilates class, which I look forward to, or we go cross-country skiing as a family in the middle of winter. These are pretty regular occurrences in my life. When I get to go to a festival with my family and spend some time within our community, seeing incredible performances, eating local food, that provides a really unique time and space for us to reconnect. We know that through festivals and events, there are many individual benefits. People gain a lot personally from attending festivals and events. They're meaningful to people's lives, and we often find, we're doing research now on customer relationship management and how festival organizations relate to their attendees, and we find that there are many attendees that are deeply passionate about their festival organizations and that are deeply committed to seeing festival organizations succeed. And so we know that there are many individual benefits to festivals. We also know that there are many community benefits. Oftentimes, communities use festivals and events to promote tourism and argue that there are many economic benefits. And oftentimes there are excellent economic benefits for hosting community festivals and events, but more often than not, those aren't the primary outcomes for these organizations. And you'll see in a bit, when I talk a bit more about the state of festivals and events, that generating an income isn't their primary purpose. It's to provide these meaningful community experiences where people can gather together. Within the field of festivals and events, probably one of the best studied areas is impacts. We know a lot about the social, psychological, cultural, environmental, and economic impacts of events. Economic impacts have most definitely been one of the most studied areas within this field. We also know that there are many drawbacks to hosting community events. Often we talk about the benefits to promote them, but the communities themselves may develop resentment towards an event that maybe they don't feel belongs in their community. There may not be the economic generation that had been hoped for. So there are definitely positive and negative outcomes to hosting community events. The goal is to try and maximize the benefits and minimize the negative consequences. So I study events from a kind of tourism, recreation, leisure perspective. And so when I study them, I bring in theories, ideas, and concepts from these various fields to better understand how we're producing, creating events, engaging audiences, and providing meaningful experiences. Within tourism and recreation, there has been a lot more work on emergency management than there have been in events. So within the field of tourism, there's a lot to draw on. I have a colleague, Glory Pennington-Gray, out of University of Florida, who has done some exceptional work to understand emergency management and in particular resilience and community resilience in tourism. And so as I started working with Doug and the group at Calian, we started to realize there's very little research generated from the perspective of the festival and events community to better understand emergency management in these contexts. As I go forward, I want to make it very clear, my background is event management and leisure studies. I'm looking at emergency management from that perspective. And what I'm hoping to gain by working with you all here and hearing from people here today is a better understanding of the emergency management perspective on events. And I'm hoping that through meetings like this, we can all begin to talk together about the best way to move forward. Because as we know, collaboration is incredibly important, especially in complex sociocultural situations. So I'm just curious, how many people out here actually work for community events or festivals? Just want to get a show of hands. Handful, it looks to be maybe about a third. And then I assume there's people who work for government agencies, for services, for emergency response. Did I miss any groups in that description? No? Okay. When I talk about festivals and events, it's really important to think about the unique challenges that festivals and events place for emergency management. And I'm going to go through some, and I'm sure professionals who work in this field have many, many examples of each of these, as well as many others that I haven't identified. But I just want to set the foundation, share a few stories about the unique challenges posed before I launch into what we know about festivals and events and their current planning, because I want us to be thinking a little bit around why talk about this as its own unique thing. Why can't we just apply what we know in hospitality, recreation, tourism to this field? So one of the main unique challenges is the fact that residents and visitors are coming together to share in an experience. And we've done a lot of work around understanding resident-visitor relationships. I work with somebody out of Texas A&M, Kyle Woosnam, and we look at a concept called emotional solidarity. So how residents and visitors engage emotionally together. When I started working in emergency management for events, I started thinking about what challenges does this pose? And I have a great story from just last month. There's a large music festival that takes place in Indio, California called Coachella. Just a wave of hands if you're familiar with Coachella. It takes place in Indio. There's a music festival, people know it's Coachella because Beyonce sang there. and Cardi B, which was very interesting performance to watch. So at Coachella this year, which is a large outdoor music festival in the middle of the California desert, leading up to the festival, there were massive winds. And the festival realized they couldn't allow people into the campground to set up. Okay, in a community event, these same things kind of happen, and one might delay camping. Well, when they have to delay camping at a festival like Coachella, and you have thousands and thousands and thousands of people coming, and people are flying into LA and then driving to the desert to get to the festival, and you delay camping, where's everybody gonna stay? And so they released this information that they were gonna delay access to the campground through social media. They also used other traditional forms of media, but social media was where they put most of their effort. And so of course, the fact that we're studying social media and communications in emergency context for events, I dropped everything. I got on my software and started grabbing Facebook posts and Twitter tweets about people's reaction to that. And it was actually really impressive. The festival was absolutely on it, and they managed to provide enough information for visitors about where there are alternative places to stay. They basically said, don't go to this town, all their hotels are booked. But if you go to this town, there's a number of hotels that have space. You can't come to our campground because we're particularly vulnerable, but there's a state forest here that you are allowed to camp in, and currently they're allowing people, so check it out. So the fact that you have visitors coming in, they're not familiar with the area, they don't have resources to rely on, they can't just stay with family, presents a unique challenge. Crowds are obviously a unique challenge in this context, and many of us have heard news stories of very tragic situations where large crowds have gathered and people have unfortunately died. And crowds can often assemble very safely with the appropriate measures taken. Very sadly, there was a New Year's celebration in Shanghai a number of years ago where 36 people were trampled to death because of the crowds. And it was because there was an attempt of some people to go up a stairwell while other people were coming down the stairwell, and they had very dense crowds. And one of the last numbers I read about crowds was that if you put 7 people in 1 square meter, they become a fluid crowd, and you stop being able to control your own movement, and people can actually get lifted out of their shoes, or if they fall, trampled to death. So managing crowds presents a unique challenge to festival and events. And another point I want to make about that is just that we can't always predict how big crowds will be. The Winnipeg Jets were in the playoffs, which was very exciting, and we had a number of street parties, and I felt like the city of Winnipeg did an exceptional job managing those street parties. And what they started to do, as they were concerned that crowds might grow and grow and grow as the Jets continued to do so well, is started to issue free tickets so that they would know how many people to accept and have people register online, and so they could better manage that situation. Drugs and alcohol also pose a unique challenge in festival and event contexts. Oh, yeah, sorry. You got my back? Awesome. Drugs and alcohol also pose a unique challenge in this context. And so, as part of the celebratory nature of many community events, they're often licensed and often have beer tents and liquor venues. Currently, a lot of festivals and events are looking at how they're going to either not or they are going to integrate marijuana into that experience. It's appropriate in some cases and not in others, and how to manage that is something that many festivals are challenged with right now. But then there's of course illegal drugs that still make their way into festival settings, and many festivals have struggled with this. Obviously, at an official level, festivals work to discourage illegal drug use, but then there's the reality of people using illegal drugs on their grounds. And what some festivals have done is have taken a harm reduction approach where they have allowed for on-site testing of drugs people bring to the site. So not on-site testing of attendees, but instead attendees who choose to bring drugs to the site, they can test those drugs to see if those drugs are what they believe they are, and so that they're taking something that they think they're taking to try and reduce death from overdose. And so that presents a unique challenge in this context as well. Unique space configuration is another challenge many events have to face. And I'll give a story back from the Winnipeg Fringe. I introduced it a little bit earlier because I'll give a few examples throughout today's presentation. But the Winnipeg Fringe Theatre Festival is a large multi-genre festival, but predominantly theatre, that has over 20 indoor theatre venues as well as many outdoor sites. Those theatre venues indoor, the whole point of the Fringe is to present things in an alternative way, to kind of challenge our expectations. And so while some traditional venues are used, like the Royal Manitoba Theatre Centre, when it comes time for the Fringe, there's an effort made to change it drastically so you don't feel like you're at the theatre. Because they want to make theatre accessible. They want to make it special and fun and something unexpected. And so when they use the Royal Manitoba Theatre Centre, they put the audience on the stage and they build a stage where the audience belongs. But more often, the theatre festival is finding quirky, unique spaces, old warehouses, old buildings, and setting up venues for performances. Well, this can be challenging because these venues aren't always made to have large audiences sit for 2 hours to see a performance. And when I worked at the Fringe, we had a real problem where we had some exceptionally hot summers and people on the 6th, 7th floor of old warehouse buildings with no air conditioning. And so it was a real challenge to make sure people were safe and that didn't pose a hazard and didn't affect people's experiences. And so the unique space configurations of festivals and events can pose unique challenges. Another issue that we need to consider are the diverse stakeholders. You'll see in a few minutes, festivals and events definitely don't operate in isolation. They're highly volunteer-driven with very few staff and rely on the community to come together. And so what can be a challenge, as we know in emergency management, is that all those stakeholders need to be on board for the emergency management system to work. So finding ways to get those people to work together can be a challenge. The temporary nature of festivals and events is also challenging because organizations struggle with how much time to invest in planning for a 3-day festival for an emergency situation that is very unlikely to happen. So that poses a unique challenge. And then the fact that they're volunteer driven. And I'll talk more about this in a minute, so I'm going to skip ahead for now. So what do we know about festivals and events? Before I talk about emergency planning for festivals and events, I want to give you a sense of what we know about them as organizations. And I want you to just take a minute and think, when you hear the word festival, what festival comes to mind for you? For some people, it's going to be a small rural community harvest festival where they share food with their neighbors and they enjoy rides and activities with their family. For other people, it's going to be seeing Beyonce at Coachella. And so people have vastly different ideas of what makes up a festival and what that looks like. People also make a lot of assumptions about festivals and events. When they see a festival like the Winnipeg Fringe Theatre Festival, which attracts about 100,000 people a year and gets incredible media coverage and has local, national, and international performing audiences, they expect that there's a lot of staff that work for the festival and that the festival is a huge income generator, which is absolutely not the case. There's only one full-time permanent staff who works for the Winnipeg Fringe. Everybody else is temporary and brought on as needed, and I won't disclose their budget, but it's not likely what people expect. And so it's interesting that when we think about our community events, we actually don't necessarily know what the landscape of events looks like. So we undertook a survey of all festivals and events, community events, so these had to be public, available to the public to attend, to celebrate some aspect of the local community. And we generated a festival inventory list of all festivals in Canada and the United States. And we did this by looking at destination marketing organization websites and festival association websites. And we came up with a list of about 3,000. Now, that seems really low, especially when, as someone mentioned earlier this morning, there's 200 events in this small region. And it is low. We know we didn't capture all of the possible festivals and events. We captured festival events on these types of listings online, which means we captured festivals and events that typically attract visitors to their event or are of interest for tourism marketing purposes. But regardless, we sent an online survey to our entire list, and we had a response of 446 senior festival administrators from across Canada and the United States telling us more about their festivals. And there may be some people in here with festival organizations who received that email. We did this study back in 2016. And what we found is this is how the festivals describe themselves. So most festivals consider themselves of mixed genre. So a great example would be the Winnipeg Fringe. While they're predominantly a theater festival, that's their mandate, they have food elements, they have a stage where there's musical performances, they have an art auction area in some years, and so they're quite diverse. So they would describe themselves as a mixed festival, and almost over a third of festivals describe themselves as that. And what that tells us is that most festivals are quite diverse in what they're offering to their visitors. We also found that about a third of festivals are performance-focused in terms of their format. So what this tells us is that most festivals are going to have some sort of stage, audience setup, and so on. Most festivals take place at a single site, with fewer taking place at multiple sites. This number actually really surprised me at first, and I spent a bit of time thinking about it, and I realized that the reason for this is that with single site festivals, it's likely a lot of outdoor festivals that are seeing their park as the single site, and so even though they might be using many aspects of the park, they're considering that park a single site, and we know that most festivals are outdoor festivals. And so the multi-site festivals would be those that are using many different aspects of a community. Days in length. On average, festivals were about 7 days long. This probably doesn't surprise anybody. We have everything from one-day community events to 2-week-long cultural festivals. So an average of about 7 days long seems right. Now these are some of the numbers I wanted to chat about just a little bit more in depth. We asked festivals about how long they had been operating, and we were a little bit blown away when some festivals were telling us that they had been in operation for well over 100 years. And so we questioned that a little bit and then did a bit of digging and realized that oftentimes festivals evolve. You might start with a small concert that attracts 150 people and end 20 years later with a music festival that attracts 1.5 million people, like the Love Parade in Europe that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. So I think what this 141 years in operation tells us is that many festivals are deeply ingrained within their communities and have evolved over time. So the Small Harvest Festival that started as a dinner, over 100 years ago, where community members met to share food together, eventually evolved into the large harvest festival they know today. So because of this extreme range in numbers, we look at the median, not the average, and what we find is that the median years in operation is 18. So that means that there are just as many festivals who are in operation for less than 18 years as there were festivals in operation for more than 18 years. So the median is a really good representative of what the kind of regular experience is. But the most frequently cited length of time that festivals have been in operation was 4 years. So what we know is that festivals are ingrained within their communities, they've been around for a long time, they're stable organizations, but we see a lot of new ones coming up over time, being introduced and coming into existence. And I think that probably reflects the experiences many of you have had in your own communities. When we look at the administration of festivals, we find that the vast majority are not-for-profit. And this probably doesn't surprise anyone in this room, but I think the general public might assume many of our community events and festivals are either run by their municipality or their town, or run by a private company. But that is not the case. The vast majority are not-for-profit organizations. So their motive for operating the festival isn't to bring in an income, it's definitely to cover costs, but often the motives and the mandates of many of the festivals are beyond that, are to provide a community experience, to highlight an art form, to engage people in an activity. Festival funding. This one actually really did surprise me. I knew festivals weren't well funded because I spent a lot of time writing grant applications for festivals in my community to be able to get more money, to be able to do more. And I know from working in that community that people are unbelievable at finding resources and making things work to pull off the exceptional events we all get to attend. But most, or about getting close to a third of festivals have less than $50,000 annual operating budget, which is nothing. And so can create a real challenge, and I'll talk about some of those challenges in a few minutes. So when we look at how many staff festivals have, again, we have this huge range, 0 to 300. I kind of want to follow up with a festival that has 300 staff. Very curious about that. I have a feeling what it is it's that it's some sort of civic event where the person responding counted everybody who had a hand in producing the event, whether it was people taking care of the greens or so on. But when we look at the median number is 1, which means there were just as many people who had 1 or fewer staff people as there were who had more than 1. So many festivals and events are operating with 1 full-time paid staff person. That money goes away pretty quickly if you only have $50,000 to spend on your event. So it's probably why it's not surprising that the most common number of staff cited was 0. So no full-time permanent staff people. Now, when we look at volunteers for festivals, and so this is a total of volunteers from irregular year-round volunteers to the during festival volunteers, we again get 0 to 6,000. Not sure who the 6,000 was, but I'm guessing it was a large sporting event that came to the community temporarily. All of the survey responses are anonymous, so we have no way of identifying specific cases. We can just play a bit of a guessing game with the data we have. But the median number of volunteers is 80, which probably doesn't surprise anybody. Many festivals have a handful of volunteers, and many have hundreds. So the mean number of volunteers is 80. And what we find is that you have very few staff, huge numbers of volunteers. Some of those volunteers are exceptionally well-trained professionals like yourselves working in community, and some of them are less well-trained, or they're wanting to gain experience, which is why they're involved in the festival or event. And so there's that huge range of experience brought to the festival organization. When we look at the audience that festivals attract, we find that the vast majority of the festivals are local and regional. So they focus on their local community and hopefully draw in visitors from elsewhere. Oftentimes there are tourists who attend events, but a kind of typical number we throw around in tourism and event studies is that you're really gonna see maybe like 10% of your audience is gonna be coming from away in the kind of typical community festival and event. And when we look at the attendees, we find that the largest number of festivals say that they have fewer than 5,000 attendees. So 36% of the festivals that responded have fewer than 5,000. Another 12% have between 5,000 and 9,000. So a lot of our community festivals are fairly small. So that is just to kind of paint a picture of what we know about festivals in general before I get into some specifics. And what we know is that festivals are meaningful parts of our community that people engage in for a huge range of motives that have impacts that are positive and negative, but that these organizations are often operating with very few resources and accomplishing an awful lot. You're getting a lot of bang for your buck with festival and event organizations. They're excellent at using resources across festivals and events as well as partnering within their communities. They are also, though, very vulnerable to emergencies. And I'm going to talk a bit about that. So having worked in festival and event management for a long time, I started a study a number of years ago where we looked at how people integrate mobile technology into these contexts. And we had federal funding and we ran a 5-year project. And it was a really fantastic experience where we got to work with festivals in Alberta, Manitoba, and here in Ontario. One of the findings of the study around mobile device use in these contexts came down to safety and security. A lot of people have their phones with them, not surprising to anyone because we all do it, because it's just a bit of a safety net. You want to feel like you have an ability to get yourself out of a difficult situation, and so people carry their phones with them. Well, that got us thinking. We were doing a whole bunch of other stuff with that study that I'm not going to talk about at all, but that got us thinking a lot about the role of safety and security and how do we make positive experiences for visitors if they're feeling unsafe or not secure. And because I'm very interested, and our team is very interested in the leisure experience, which leisure experiences are characterized by a sense of freedom, self-determination, enjoyment, positive affect. And so how do we maintain all those qualities that make people want to go to festivals and events while still ensuring that they're safe and secure? And so we started to look at what festivals are doing, because while there are many one-off case studies of unique festivals across the world and how they've managed different emergency situations or disasters, there is almost no research that looks across the festival landscape about what's happening at a big picture level across festivals. And so we've designed 3 studies to start giving us some preliminary kind of ground level information that we can use to design more studies and that we can use to work with festivals to enhance safety and security at these events. So again, we love to send out online surveys. So we took that festival inventory we had, we emailed 1,000 Canadian festivals. Some of you might have gotten that email. I'm absolutely certain many festivals who received this email from us thought it was spam or phishing and deleted it, which was fine. We weren't looking to get a representative sample. All we wanted to do was contact festivals and say, hey, do you have any emergency planning documents you'd be willing to share with us? Because we're looking to analyze emergency planning documents and see what information people are putting in them and how prepared are festivals and how do they use these documents. So we got a response from 18 festivals who emailed us back right away, sent us their documents, and were very happy to participate. But what surprised me was that we got 19 emails that of people who responded, didn't just delete our email and said, you know what, actually we don't have that. And some of them actually, they themselves seemed surprised. And I'll share with you some of their comments. And then we had 9 festivals who said, we're not interested. We have a festival happening next week. We're not responding to your email, but get back to us at some other time. So those festivals that did not have emergency planning documents, in their email response to us, said things like, we're just a small community-run event by volunteers. We don't have formal plans. And then the other kind of tone of email we received was, I really want to do this. I hope to create a document within the next few months. If I can find the time or someone to help me, we'd really like to know what you learn. And those 2 sentiments really characterize the things we heard from festivals, is that they don't have the time or they don't feel it's necessary for those that didn't have the emergency plans. For those that did have emergency planning documents, they were pretty much what you'd expect. They had a chain of command, contact list, site plan, evacuation plan, communication plan. That was way less common. But they often had things like a missing child protocol or severe weather protocol that had details about what to do in those particular situations. This isn't based on our study, this slide. This is based on research done out of Australia in 2003 at an outdoor music festival, where they actually looked at volunteer preparedness, and they surveyed volunteers at a festival and asked about volunteers' knowledge and experience with emergency plans and emergency documents. And what they found was that less than half of volunteers had any knowledge of hazards, had any knowledge of emergency management, had any sense of an emergency plan. less than half knew who the area coordinator was, less than half knew how to manage a public health issue, and less than half knew their role during an emergency. Now, we know that most events are heavily run by volunteers. Most events might have one full-time permanent staff person, if at all. And so this is a concerning statement. This was a single case study of one event. It doesn't represent other festivals. All it does is describe what was happening at that festival. But based on the other information we know, in some ways this isn't at all surprising. So festivals and events have to work really hard with very limited resources to try and ensure that festivals are safe and secure environments. They're working with mostly volunteers and often without any formal planning documents. And so this is a problem that we hope to address through our research. With our research, our next plan after analyzing these documents is to hold focus groups with festival and event planners from communities to look at the other ways in which they're planning to prepare for emergencies and disasters, as well as hold focus groups with other community members. A great example of a festival that didn't have proper plans in place was the Love Parade that took place in Germany. Is anybody familiar with that festival? It's a large music festival. It started, I believe, back in the 80s. Don't cite my numbers exactly with this one, but they started as 150 people getting together to listen to electronic dance music, or techno at the time. And it gained in success, it grew, it gained in success, it grew. It ended up being like 1.2 million attendees at this event, and they changed venues numerous times to accommodate the huge numbers of people that wanted to attend this festival. The festival was fairly laissez-faire in their approach to managing crowds. They did recognize that it was important. However, when asked about the concern about bringing that many people together to attend a festival, the CEO at the time of the last festival was kind of like, whatever, it'll be fine. It wasn't fine. What ended up happening is that crowds became so huge that police had the unfortunate task of having to not allow any more people into the festival site because not enough festival patrons had left. And there were hundreds of thousands of people waiting to get into the festival. And so, as you can imagine, that's a frightening situation for anyone. There were people inside the festival grounds who just desperately wanted to get out. And so they tried to mount a stairwell to get out. And I believe around 21 people died in a stampede that happened as a result of that. There's been a great study done on that festival and on who's to blame. And the study doesn't actually look to place blame. The study looks at how the community blamed people during that event. And what they found was that people were looking for anyone to blame. People blamed the police, people blamed the festival, people blamed the municipality. People blamed all sorts of different people. And the blame game never seemed to end. And at the conclusion of the research paper, what they said is that what was really unfortunate was that the blame game actually didn't start by attendees. It started by the police and the festival blaming each other in the middle. And blaming each other in the media, sorry. And so they started this blaming that then audiences took up. And that kind of exploded into finding who's at fault. And the authors of the paper suggest that in the future, an important lesson learned is that you really want to work together in a coordinated effort to make sure that you're not playing this kind of blame game, and instead you deal with the issues that need to be dealt together as a team. And so had they had a plan in place for how to work with media in the case of a major event, maybe this blame game wouldn't have played out. Do I have 5 more minutes? Am I good? Just keep talking. I could talk all day. When people start nodding off, then stop. Is that what you're saying? Crisis communication during a festival emergency. This is a really exciting project that we've just started, and I'm actually working with Calian on it, and we received money from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council to work on this research project. This project is less about preparedness and planning and more about communication during a festival emergency. So we know that communication during an emergency is absolutely critical. If you want to prevent bad crowd experiences that result in mass exodus and potentially trampling, if you want to let people know where to go to get shelter, if you've had to close the campground and there's people in from out of town, we need to be able to effectively communicate that information during the festival. So what we wanted to do is look at online social media communication during a festival emergency. Right when we were conceptualizing this project last fall was right when the Harvest 91 Las Vegas shootings happened. And it was a really, I became heavily involved in following social media because I was working on this project. And so it was really disturbing in some ways, obviously, but it was also really enlightening. In that particular case, the police did an absolutely exceptional job of communicating in the moment with the community about what was going on, what was expected of them, how to keep safe, what rumors existed, and so on. And there's a number of news reports about what an excellent job they did. But I think one of the most important things that we saw in that case was the collaboration between the police and the local community in sending out consistent messages together. So that was a really inspiring example of how collaboration can work effectively in a really terrible situation. So that was a really inspiring example of the kinds of things we wanted to better understand. So we were interested in understanding when there's natural, technical, or human-induced emergencies during a festival that actually result in the halt of the festival. How are groups communicating with each other through social media? What's effective, what's not? As well as who's connected to whom and how is information traveling through the actual network. So my team at the Leisure Tourism Lab at the University of Manitoba, we combed through endless news stories, endless Google searches to find festivals that had emergencies that were significant enough that the festival actually had to be stopped or completely canceled for the remainder of the festival. And we did a 5-year period, and these were some of the festivals we found. I know you can't read the detail writing. What I want you to pay attention to in this slide is the highlighting. And the first bulk of festivals are those that had some sort of human-induced emergency or disaster, a fight, overcrowding, overheating and drug use, shooting on site. The second batch of festivals are those that experienced a natural disaster or a natural process that threatened the festival. So heavy rain, snow, fire. And then the last two are examples of technical failure that resulted in some sort of emergency. So the stage fire at Tomorrowland Festival in Europe, and then at Detonate Festival there was a tent safety problem that resulted in the shutdown of the event. So we're in the thick of this study now, and I don't know how many people follow social media and follow social media, the politics of it and so on, but right in the middle of us starting our study was the whole Facebook going to court situation. And so how we access Facebook data was challenged and is challenging, but we have great computer scientists that work with us. And so we're in the process of collecting data, social media posts from before, during, and after 3 of those events I just showed up there. And what we're planning to do is look at who's talking to whom and how. We're interested in social media because we know it's heavily adopted worldwide, so the findings of this could be relevant to festivals all over the world. We know that festivals adopt social media at a really high rate, but so does the general public. An interesting point here for our festival administrators who are here today is that we all think that Facebook and Twitter are the be-all and end-all, but if you look at the general public's use of social media, it's actually Facebook and Instagram that top the list. So that it's just a moment to pause and think about what social media you're relying on for your event. We know from the study I talked about earlier on that there are very few paid staff at festivals. When there are, when we look at the social media management for festivals, only 59% of festivals have a paid staff person running their social media. Oftentimes it's a volunteer. And most of those people are doing it on top of many other responsibilities. So when we think about using social media for emergency management, and you have a single staff person who has many other responsibilities, and now there's an emergency situation, how effective can they be at responding to the emergency through social media is a question we want to better understand. There are many challenges with social media. One of the challenges is staff resources. It's intensive. It takes a lot of time to effectively manage social media, and if you have communications staff, they'll tell you that. Most of these festivals don't. The timing is absolutely critical, especially during an emergency situation, and I'll talk a bit about how important it is to be on it consistently in a moment. We always think of social media as free. Everybody thinks, oh great, this is a free way to get the word out. It is by no means free. It takes up so much time and energy that we need to think about how many resources we have to invest in social media. And it requires specialized knowledge to use effectively. What we found when we work with festivals is that many of them have either someone in the organization who loves Facebook personally and is on it all the time and posting pictures of their kids and all the awesome things they're doing, and then they put that person in charge of social media for the organization. Well, managing your personal social media account is very different than communicating through social media for an organization. The other thing we see that often happens is that festivals will have someone who hates social media, who isn't familiar with social media, manage the social media account. So when we think of all of these challenges with social media, and then we think with how important it is to respond very clearly and effectively during an emergency, it creates additional concerns. The main issues with social media that we need to think about when we're using it during an emergency situation, which I would argue you pretty much have to use it because that is one of the first places attendees will go to for information. One of the main issues is multiple hashtags and usernames, and I contributed to this problem for a festival and I own that. What often happens is that the community starts a hashtag before the festival gets theirs out there, and now you have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different things that people are tagging in social media. And so as a festival organization, you might be looking at what people are tagging about your particular hashtag festival. Meanwhile, you don't know that the actual public is using hashtag festival 2018. And so you need to be on top of that. I was fortunate to be living in the United States when Facebook was first invented. And when Facebook first came out, it was meant specifically for university students, and I was at university. So I had a very early Facebook account, and I was still doing work for the Winnipeg Fringe, so I started their first Facebook page. And now it's dead and lost to the world, and they tried to delete it, and I can't remember the password, and they're stuck with it. And I'm sorry, and I apologize to them regularly about that. I really need to figure out how to get back on. But it's happened with other organizations I work with. I'm the vice president of the Travel Tourism Research Association. Someone at some point in history created a LinkedIn page for us. We don't know who did it. We don't know the password, and LinkedIn won't give it to us or cancel the account. So that can be a real problem, especially when you want to start using these for emergency management, and you need to make sure you have control over the message that's being sent out. Another major issue is monitoring and access loss. The issue with monitoring really comes around rumors. There is great research on rumors in social media during emergency, and a lot of the rumors that have been studied come from the Boston bombings, because that was a major social media, one of the first major uses of social media in that kind of situation that we saw on such a huge scale. And Kate Starbird from Seattle, from Washington, she's done a number of studies to look at how rumors spread during an emergency through social media. And there's a few really key things that we've learned from her research, and that is that misinformation travels incredibly quickly, picks up really quickly, that corrected information kind of peaks with misinformation and goes down with misinformation. However, it never catches up to misinformation. I have yet to see a case of that happening. So during the Boston bombings, there were all sorts of rumors flying around. And what would happen is, I think one rumor in particular, the rate was 44 repeated instances of misinformation to every one piece of corrected information. How do you fight that? How do you get the information out there? And what they find is that the misinformation stays in social media and continues to get recirculated way longer than the corrected information. So that tells us a few things. During emergency situations, we want to be very quick to correct information. We want to make that corrected information really attractive and interesting and engaging so people share it at a high rate. And even though you think you've corrected it, you want to keep pushing out that corrected information for a much longer time because the misinformation is going to stick around forever. And then shifting responsibility. Within a lot of organizations, there's no consistent use of social media. One year it's volunteer, this year it's a staff, and that's really problematic if you want to use it for communicating during an emergency. And then there's many missed opportunities. I gave the example earlier of the Las Vegas incident. That was an excellent example of collaboration, but there are many opportunities that are missed where the local community groups are not working effectively with the event, or the event isn't working effectively with the community group to share consistent message using each other's hashtags so that people are getting connected. So when we talk about approaches to social media for crisis communication, obviously having a plan in place is absolutely critical, but we know that there are very few emergency plans in place in general, so that's problematic. Another really important piece is to automate. There are some great social media automators out there, things like Hootsuite, that allow organizations to pre-program in tweets and posts well in advance, have a date that it's sent to go out and go out. So a great use of that would be to have your site evacuation plan set up as a tweet and a Facebook post with no date to be sent out. But then when something does go wrong and you need people to have that information, you can send it out to all your social media platforms with the push of the button. The message is already pre-programmed. I just want to highlight from this side that organizations need to look at who social media influencers are and to be able to identify those people and use those people to share their message. And we have many ways of doing that. So I'm going to wrap up by talking about festival cancellation, and this is where I'm going to end my talk today. So there are many festivals that never get to the point of actually operating, and they're shut down before the festival actually happens. There's some recent examples in the news of the Edmonton Heritage Festival that's concerned it may have to shut down this year because of rising police costs. The second most common reason they're cancelled is because of external forces, things like the weather or lack of political support. Many events are new and produced informally, but they evolve over time and eventually become seen as an institution. What we know from the existing research is even event institutions, events like the Edmonton Heritage Festival, they're vulnerable to failure. They're reliant on few pots of money, and they're reliant on each year to be able to operate the next year. So when costs begin to escalate and there's unexpected costs, that can pose a really unique challenge. Also, when there's a disaster on site, if people respond negatively, many festivals are at risk of not returning. A great example is Tomorrow World that happened in Georgia and had massive mud issue during their festival. They were never able to come back with the incredibly negative experience that people had during that festival. So what's lost? Well, we already know that festivals and events provide a really meaningful, unique leisure experience within our communities to allow people to celebrate together and share their culture. What do we need to do to make sure those losses don't happen? Is make sure that we work together as stakeholders, both internal to the festival organizations, but with our external stakeholders and the impacted end community. And I think that's where, with the many stories I've told, there's been a breakdown between communication, whether it's communicating with the public through social media, whether it's planning for the event in advance, or whether it's dealing with the challenges of bearing the costs of things like safety and security. This is a photo from Tomorrow World in Georgia, where they had massive rainstorms, massive mud. They had no way to get people off the site. People had to sleep in the mud. In the middle of the night, they were walking through forests like the Walking Dead, trying to get off of the festival site. But there was no collaboration between transportation and between the festival, and so people were stranded. What we want to see is experiences like this. experiences where we're able to provide safe and secure environments where people can engage in their community and have a positive experience working with the festivals, the vendors, the emergency responders, and everybody within the community. And that's the goal.